Why is death life's only certainty other than taxes and declining vigor? Why do the sexes often senesce at different rates? They have the same genes, after all, and the same ecology. And why do species differ so much in lifespans and schedules of reproduction? And they do. It's a great deal of variation, even within relatively closely related taxa. There can be lots of variation in life histories. Evolutionary theory in recent years has been remarkably successful in providing insight into how these differences between the ages and the sexes end up evolving. And the patterns can be dramatic. For example, in these red deer, as they're called in the UK, we would call them elk, the females, hinds, tend to start reproducing at just a few years of age and continue reproducing at a low rate throughout a long lifespan. The males don't reproduce at all until they're up to 7, 8, 9 years of age. Then they reproduce much more on average and plummet thereafter. And this is reflected in their survival curves, which are reasonably similar at first, but then diverge later in life. These are the kinds of patterns we would like to be able to explain. The theory that you've probably encountered, that's been popular for many decades, is often called the rate of living theory. And for a long time, it was the best thing we had. The idea was that organisms simply wear out. They are machines, after all, and machines wear out. That's all true enough. And so the idea is that for some reason, which is never stated exactly, organisms are unable to repair all the oxidative damage, mutations, and other grief that they suffer as a result of just living in the world. This theory makes a prediction, which is that the rate of aging should be directly tied to the metabolic rate, and that species should not be able to evolve longer lifespans without reducing their metabolic rate. So the idea here is that lifetime energy expenditure, as shown on the x-axis of this figure from the textbook, should be more or less constant for all species, at least all the species in a given taxon. And people have sometimes claimed that that is more or less true. But in fact, this evidence is not altogether convincing. Look at these bats, for example. Not only do they, on average, have a vastly higher lifetime energy expenditure than any other comparable group of mammals, but within themselves, they have an enormous amount of variation. This is variation among species of bats who have evolved very different life histories involving very different amounts of lifetime energy expenditure. And my favorite counterexample to this hypothesis comes from hummingbirds, who are very small, like mice. They have very high metabolic rates, body temperatures of well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, just at resting even. Many species migrate thousands of miles north and south seasonally and live to ages of 10 or 20 years. Many of you are probably aware that some of the hummingbirds coming back to your hummingbird feeders year after year are the same animals, and they've been down to Central or even South America in the winter when they weren't around your back porch. So they're a counterexample to that idea. They show you can have a long life and a scorchingly high metabolic rate. Here's a wonderful experiment with Drosophila, again from the textbook, and I urge you to read the explanation of it, in which 2 lines were selected for late reproduction, that is to say, early eggs were simply discarded. The lines were propagated only from eggs laid, say, a few weeks after the female was first hatched. The control lines were subject to no such selection. And what happened within 10 or 15 generations was that the average longevity of the late reproducing experimental flies was hugely extended. They came to live much longer, very quickly, than the other line through this experimentally evolved adjustment of their schedule of reproduction, and there was no notable change in their metabolic rate, but they came to live a lot longer. So here's the clicker questions. The data summarized in these graphs, do they support or refute the rate of living theory? Well, obviously, I think the right answer is they refute it. So how do we now understand this and explain it with evolutionary theory? The first important advance is due to Peter Medawar, yet another great British biologist of the last century, who pointed out that selection weakens as life advances. It was in the 50s. He wrote a famous paper pointing out that selection against harmful, deleterious mutations, which we've talked about a lot, that have effects that appear only late in life. Right? These are bad genes that are bad for you if you make it to middle or late age, but they don't harm you when you're young. Selection, he argued, against such deleterious mutations will be much weaker than selection against an otherwise equivalent mutation whose effects first manifest early in life, if there is inescapable extrinsic mortality, meaning sources of mortality that are going to strike no matter whether you are potentially very long-lived or not. These would include, for example, being eaten by a predator, or falling off a cliff, or I suppose succumbing to a pandemic disease. All sorts of things that are not a function of whether you have this late-acting deleterious mutation. The argument for this being the case, his argument was that, well, we have many more deleterious mutations as oldsters because ones that survived in evolution were ones that, if possible, put off their bad effects till later in life. So here's a complicated but important figure from the textbook that shows how this works. It's just a life table where the rows are ages, let's say in years. The blue column is just the survival curve, the life table. This idealized life history has a 20% mortality rate per year, so it's just a straight exponential decline in total survival, but no senescence. That is to say, the probability of dying per year does not go up. It remains the same. Then the reproductive schedule in this hypothetical species is that you don't reproduce at age 1 or 2, but if you're still alive, which you are with probability of about a half, you start reproducing at age 3, and you continue reproducing one offspring a year for the rest of your life, as long as you live, say to 15 years or longer. So this is a non-senescing life history with reproduction beginning at age 3. All right, here's Medawar's argument. The expected reproductive success for an individual born then is 0, 0, and 0 for their 0th, 1st, and 2nd years. Then, yes, 0.512 is the chance they're still alive at age 3. If they are, they have an offspring, and then they continue to have their one offspring as long as they live, which is down to a probability of 3.5% when they get to 15 years of age. The late effect, so that's the non-senescing life cycle. Medawar's argument is that the late affecting mutations accumulate, as we said, at higher rates than early effect mutations, causing senescence because they have so little consequence. And although Heron and Freeman don't illustrate that argument, I do here on the figure by imagining the Medawar mutation that kills you at age 15 if you happen to have lived that long. Okay, that's a 3.5% chance you got there, but if you do, you're out. And what difference does that make to total lifetime reproductive success? It's just tiny, right? Your expected lifetime reproduction drops to 2.385 offspring from 2.419. So in percentage, a very small reduction. So he's right. The selection against such mutations would be relatively weak. They would still be deleterious, but not catastrophically so. Then some years later, George Williams, who was at SUNY Stony Brook for many years, a great American evolutionary theorist, pointed out that mutations with harmful, even lethal effects late in life could actually be positively favored by selection. That is, rather than merely being tolerable, they could be adaptive if they also increased reproduction early in life. And this was a great advance in the subject because it provides much more power for natural selection to reshape life histories. Heron and Freeman do illustrate this argument with a figure in the chapter. These are called pleiotropic trade-offs because it's one thing there's a pleiotropic effect, a side effect of early and late fitness on survival and on reproduction. And so the model here begins at the same point with the initially immortal life history from the previous figure, 20% mortality per year. But then the Williams mutation kills you at age 10 if you're lucky enough to still be alive. That's vastly worse than the Medawar mutation. But here's the difference. The pleiotropic effect, the trade-off, the deal with the devil, if you like, of this mutation is that when you have it, instead of waiting to age 3 to start reproducing, you start at age 2. All right, so there's a subtle difference, but these green dots and the reproductive success column is moved up by a year. You don't start at age 3 when your chance of being alive is 51%. You start at age 2 when your chance of being alive is 64%. And the price for that early maturation and reproduction is you drop dead later in life if you're so lucky as to still be alive then. Now you might think that looks like a pretty bad deal, but in fact, look at the result. Under the same rules, same ecology, otherwise, this life history expects 2.66, nearly 2.7 offspring, which is a substantially larger positive advantage than the Medawar mutation was a negative advantage. And so this idea, this argument of Williams, is a cornerstone of how we now try to think about the evolution of life histories. We look for the pleiotropic trade-offs. So if the theory is correct, then life histories in general will be shaped by rates of extrinsic mortality, which arise from just the basic ecology and way of life of a species, and the costs of reproduction. Notice that the Williams model from the previous slide invokes to justify this trade-off that reproduction is costly, starting it early does something that makes you less able to fend off mortality later in life. And those of you who are parents are nodding your heads going, yeah, we know all about that. We have discovered reproduction is costly. It takes it out of you. And indeed, extrinsic mortality rates do vary enormously between different groups of animals who tend to have characteristically different life histories that are, on the face of it, broadly in conformance with the expectations we would get from this argument. So, for example, rodents who live on the ground suffer far higher rates of predation, say from snakes and so on, than do bats, who can fly away from danger, hang out in trees, nest in caves in places where no predator could possibly get to them, and so on, spend all their time dreaming up new viral diseases to inflict on people. They're so bored and so full of themselves. That's all they do. And the rates of senescence go in the way we would expect. Rodents of a given size and metabolic rate especially live far shorter maximum lifespans than do bats that you might think would be comparable in various ways. All right, so this has set off then a lot of work on the study of the costs of reproduction, which are the other key element in this subject. Here's a beautiful study, again, from the textbook on this flycatcher, Ficedula albicollis, studied in Scandinavia, I believe, in which the experimenters have done a number of both observational and studies and experiments, as we'll see. It happens in the population they work on. Some females begin reproducing in their first year, so they have a clutch at age 1, then 2, 3, and 4, if they live that long, which many of them do, being birds. And here are their clutch sizes in the range of 6 eggs, plus or minus. But some females skip the first year and don't get married and start reproducing until they're 2 years old. And look what they do. They start out with a larger average clutch size than the early breeders ever reach, even at their peak in age 3. Their age 3 peak is substantially higher, slightly over 7 eggs, and then they come down similarly in age 4. That looks like a better deal, doesn't it? But which class of females actually have the greater reproductive success? What do you think? Those who breed at age 1 or age 2? With clickers, most people will go for age 2, but in fact it's not true. Females that begin at age 1 do have higher lifetime fitness, about 1 1/4 offspring successfully fledged, than do those that begin at age 2, which have about 0.9 offspring in their data set. And here's the paper in Nature, very short, sweet, easy to read. I highly recommend it if you want to see some real science from which data like this come. They also did this great experiment in which they added eggs to the clutches of females in this larger class who begin reproducing at age 1. And notice that from this figure you can see that starting at age 2 is sort of a minority condition. Their sample sizes, which are these numbers above the bars, are much lower for the age 2 first reproduction group than for the age 1 group. So that's starting at age 1 is what they want to do if they can, apparently. And anyway, so the experiment they did was to add 1 extra egg to the nests of some of the females that began reproducing at age 1. And here's what happened. In the first year, when they added the egg, the females did fledge slightly more chicks. But in years 2, 3, and 4, when there was no manipulation, they did significantly worse than the females who were unmanipulated in their first year. This is among the most compelling pieces of evidence I know of to show that reproduction, that is reproductive effort, does take it out of you. You notice it a year later if you tried to rear one more chick than you had originally intended as a 1-year-old. Another prediction of the theory is that when extrinsic mortality is lowered, and remember that's the key factor that underlies why this all works, it's that the future is discounted because there's a substantial probability you won't live to attempt to reproduce then anyway, because the predators or something will have got you in the meantime, so go for it when you're young. Right? The theory predicts that if we can reduce rates of extrinsic mortality, then rates of senescence should evolve downward, which is to say longevity and vigor late in life should evolve upward because the trade-off structure would be changed. Here's a wonderful study by Steve Austad, who's worked on life history in mammals for his whole career. This is about opossums that live on a predator-free island off of South Carolina. It's called Sapelo Island. And the possums who got there several thousand years ago, apparently, but are separated now from the mainland populations, they reproduce more slowly than those on the South Carolina mainland, where there are much higher rates of mortality, that's the extrinsic mortality, through predation by bobcats and other predators that are present on the mainland but not on the island. And so here's a life table with a logarithmic proportion surviving scale for the y-axis and age in months. And you can see on the mainland nobody lives much beyond 2 years, but on the island some live nearly to 4 years. And guess what? On the mainland, the first year clutches are fed much more and increase in weight much more rapidly. Second year clutches, not so fast, consistent with the view that the parents are really kind of tired out at that point. On the island, the rates of clutch provisioning are much lower, and they don't differ between years. Another remarkable bit of senescence that has evolved downward on the island has to do with collagen cross-linking in tendons, which is what makes them stiff as we get older, right? We lose our flexibility. That's in part a result of collagen becoming cross-linked, so it's taken as a sign of senescence due to oxidation. Basically, it's a form of oxidative damage, and it can be estimated by the time it takes to break pieces of collagen, that is of tendon, in an experimental assay. You can read about that in the textbook. The long and short of it is that there already has evolved, in the time the possums have been isolated on the island, they've evolved a lower rate of collagen cross-linking. On the mainland, this rate of cross-linking goes up much more steeply and reaches a higher level, say at 2 years of age, than it does on the island, where the rate of increase is slower. And sure enough, litter sizes have also changed. First-year litter sizes are like 7.6 on the mainland, only 5.7 on the island. So females have evolved to take better care of themselves, to reproduce in a more cautious way, and they do get the payoff of many more of them living to produce a second or even a third litter much more often than on the island. Than on the mainland. Offspring size and number are hinted at by that previous story, and it is indeed a fundamental trade-off. It's been actually mostly worked on in birds, where it's very easy to study, and the argument about the trade-off and that there should be an intermediate optimal offspring size and offspring number goes like this. Selection is always favoring the fittest phenotype, wouldn't you say? Yes, that's what we've been arguing by definition. So when it comes to offspring, having more of them is better, right? Yes, other things being equal, more offspring means more fitness, okay? So offspring number and offspring number perfectly correlated, and offspring number, fledged anyway, is our measure of fitness. So yes, other things being equal. So what's not equal? Well, resources, food, for example. So you mean in a big family, each of the kids get less to eat. That's right. So we expect there to be, not for us so much, but for many other species, an inevitable trade-off between offspring number and individual offspring fitness. Right. So this is a graph that I made, right, of W, fitness, as a function of little n, the offspring number, right, where Y The y-axis is the fitness of individual offspring, not all of them together. So yeah, that's a plausible assumption. So what's the fittest family size? Well, it's the one that maximizes the parent's fitness on the assumption, which is reasonable, that the parents get to choose the family size. So what's the parent's fitness? It's the sum of all the offspring's fitnesses. Yes? Yes, you have to agree. It's the number of offspring we had times the fitness of each. Okay? So that would be, in algebraic terms, n, little n, the clutch size or brood size, whatever you want to call it, times W of n. Yes. So what is that? Well, if we multiply these two curves together, offspring number as a function of offspring number, and the fitness of individual offspring as a function of offspring number, we get this parabola, which is the parent's fitness, that's n times W sub n, and it has a well-defined maximum at what the theorists in this field like to call n star, the star meaning it's the optimal equilibrium number. Yes. So we can solve for the fittest family size strategy by just taking the derivative of this parent's fitness function with respect to n, the number of offspring, then set it equal to 0 and solve. Right. Okay, and that's the way evolutionary models are constructed and analyzed in this field, and they've been very illuminating. So here are the examples from the textbook. You should read this chapter. It's quite a good one in Heron and Freeman. They show it this way: number of offspring times size of individual offspring, showing just a trade-off. If the parents have just a certain amount of resource to invest, then it sort of has to be an inverse curvy function like that. Then one imagines the survival probability of individual offspring goes up as a function of their size, which is to say of the total amount of investment each one gets. Well then, what's the parental fitness achieved through a given clutch? Again, it's the product of those two curves. And so for that example, which comes from the work, classic work from the 70s of Smith and Fretwell, this is the curve you would get. This is parental fitness as a function of, here, the size of individual offspring rather than their number, but it works the same way. There's an optimal size in this simple model, which is around 2 units of whatever it is that parents should do, which is to say they make many fewer offspring than they could, and they make offspring of sizes smaller than they could, right? But it's an intermediate optimum of total fitness from their point of view. And this theory works like a dream in many kinds of situations. It's been embraced by fisheries biologists, for example, who are constantly worried about their policies and have a well-defined scale of virtue for the populations of salmon or whatever that they're managing, and you can see these principles at work often in real time. So this is a complicated story about salmon in the Pacific Northwest. It shows the x-axis here is egg mass, meaning the size of individual salmon eggs, and it has varied in these populations that have been followed and which are manipulated in the sense that many of the eggs come from hatcheries that are managed by biologists. So they've shown, for example, that indeed egg survival is positively related to mean egg mass, and it goes up, and relative fecundity is negatively related to egg size, of course, because females who make bigger eggs have to make fewer of them. Their models predict what the optimum should be, and it's pretty close to what the fish were doing in recent years when this study was done. These graphs, fascinatingly, show history of egg sizes total egg volumes and individual egg masses over a couple of decades. That this species was followed in a number of different rivers where different fractions of all the spawners are hatchery fish. They have ways of recognizing which are the hatchery fish, and sure enough, the egg mass of hatchery-raised fish went down and down and down because they were basically being selected to make more eggs because the fisheries biologists were taking care of defending the eggs, and the natural relationship between egg mass and survivability no longer applied. So sure enough, egg size evolved downward, and then egg size and volume went downward historically in these rivers, more steeply in the rivers where a larger fraction of all the fish were originally hatchery fish. All right. Then to the data on birds, which are not of practical importance, but really beautiful because they're so rich and detailed. These chickadees, which are called great tits in England, in Whitham Wood, just outside Oxford University, have been studied for many decades by David Lack, who's now dead, I believe, and his generations of students who put up nest boxes and follow the reproduction of pairs year after year after year after year, gathering really beautiful detailed data. And so here's a graph that I made showing the frequency of clutches as a function of the number of eggs the parents lay, which range all the way from 1 to 17 in this long data set. And then it also shows the number of surviving per clutch, that is the number the parents fledge, which is typically less than 1. This is a risky business. There's a lot of mortality among the hatchlings and young birds. And notice what it shows. The most frequent clutches are those with 8 or 9 eggs, and that's smaller than the most productive clutches, which turns out in this data set 12 egg clutches were those that fledged the most chicks. So what's the problem? Have the birds not read the papers on what their life histories should be? Are they just ignorant? Don't they care about fitness? What's the problem with them? Well, it turns out, of course, there's not a problem with them. It's a problem with our understanding of what they're doing. So to address the question, Lack and his students started manipulating clutch sizes, removing eggs from some nests and adding them into others. Anywhere from 1 to 4 eggs added to some nests and 1 to 7 removed from others, and then followed the fates of the parents and the chicks. So it turned out that adding more than 1 or 2 eggs almost always resulted actually in a lower reproductive success for the parents. So laying more eggs was not the solution. So it suggests parents did know what they were doing when they decided to lay a clutch of a certain size. And so the explanation is, of course, that parents differ in their ability to provide for offspring, and they knew it, and adjusted their clutch sizes to their current conditions of their own body fitness, their own ability to forage for the kind of food that the chicks would need in abundance right after they come out of the egg. So the typical 9-egg parents, if you study these graphs again that I made in a review some years ago, which show the data 2 different ways, the typical 9-egg parents are indeed maximizing their expected reproductive success under their circumstances, as were all parents. So these upper ones show that, if you were a 9-egg clutch, adding 1 egg may improve your fitness that year. Doesn't say what happens next year, but adding more than 2 actually reduced your output even in the present year, and the same is true for smaller clutches as well. And this shows offspring recruited as a function of the brood size after manipulation, and it shows the same thing, which is that either removing eggs or adding eggs tended to actually reduce the parents' fitness. So we infer that the evolved function of the clutch size decision or strategy is to help the parents fledge as many healthy chicks as they can, given their current condition. Now, as you know, people think that we should be able to defeat our mortality. Evolutionary biologists are not so sure. Some years ago, a longevity gene was discovered in C. elegans, the nematode. It was called AGE1. It's a protein, a kinase required for regulation of metabolism, stress resistance, and embryonic development, and it affects lifespan. So people got quite excited. They found mutations that could increase lifespan by as much as 80%. One of these turned out to be selectively neutral in a rich food environment, but actually deleterious under food limitation. This is just letting it go in a self-sustaining population for a number of generations, 12 generations, starting from a frequency of 50%. Under food stress, it always declined in frequency, even though it made the worms live longer. In a food-rich environment, it didn't. It kind of stayed at whatever frequency you started it at for, again, something like 10 generations. So the longevity comes at a price, which is the worms are much less able to deal with nutritional stress, and helps explain why, in fact, the gene remains unmutated in wild populations of C. elegans. There's an analogous story about the so-called Methuselah gene in Drosophila, which is explained in Heron and Freeman on page 506. I commend that page to your attention. Finally, why do human females live so long after last reproduction? We are famous for our menopause, and it is a truly remarkable feature of our life history, with really no or almost no parallels anywhere in the natural world that we know of. Very few animals do it, and we certainly don't expect it, right? Why would you go on living after you could no longer reproduce? You should have made more babies when you were younger or something, huh? Well, no. So our own colleague, Kristen Hawkes of the Anthro Department, a great biologist and student of social behavior, proposed a really wonderful theory, which is that non-reproductive grandmothers in our ancestral past helped their daughters reproduce by helping to feed and otherwise care for the daughter's existing older children, thereby freeing mom up to reproduce more quickly than she would have been able to do without grandma's help. And as you're aware, modern grandmas do exactly that for their daughters in present-day human societies as well. What Kristen and her colleagues have done is show, especially in the Hadza, a hunting and gathering population that still lives and some people still pursue a hunting-gathering way of life in modern Africa, that in fact older women, here's a 65-year-old grandma that they got to know, remain very vitally active and among the best foragers in town, and they gather, especially in the dry season, super important tubers that are hard to get at, that take strength and knowledge and tool use and so on to get at, and they feed a lot of it to their grandkids. This figure, again from the textbook, shows for us humans, human females, how reproductive function plummets after age 40 or so in us, just as it does in chimpanzees. But all these other measures of well-being, including cardiac output, renal plasma flow, breathing capacity, and so on, decline only slowly. And the slow decline of these curves with age is paralleled by many other measures of performance. For example, marathon times for human runners, both male and female, declined in this sort of slow and graceful way among those who kept running. Okay, so the idea is Kristen's wonderful idea is grandmas made us all long-lived by being indirectly reproductive after their direct reproduction was over. And it's a fascinating pattern that the decline in fertility happens in modern humans in essentially the same way at the same time as it does in chimpanzees, but by age 50 all the chimpanzees are dead. They do not have this slow decline in actual physical fitness, physical and mental fitness, whereas we do. And that's a super interesting and important difference between us and even our closest living non-human relatives. Okay, so the summary is that because individuals will often die from random extrinsic causes of mortality, meaning causes that have nothing to do with the potential for extending life otherwise, selection on late life phenotypes is relatively weak. That's the point that Peter Medawar made back in the 1950s. And the conclusion he came to is that late-acting deleterious mutations could be, for that reason, close enough to neutral that they could hang around in the population, making us weak and disgusting and funny and so on as we get old, like me, but still alive. Okay. Then George Williams pointed out in the 50s, later in the 50s and the 60s, that early reproduction at a cost of later senescence could actually be positively favored by selection if there are pleiotropic trade-offs of various kinds that do seem plausible between reproduction and preservation of the self. And so we think that the evolutionary theory of senescence, which has been assembled out of these fundamental pieces, does a pretty good job of explaining life history variation among populations and species and higher taxa. The key idea is that resources invested in reproduction are not available for investment in survival. So the schedule of optimal total investment in offspring versus our own survival and preservation depends on future prospects. And similar trade-offs apply to investment in individual offspring, where the trade-off is between the number you can produce and the, as it were, quality of each offspring, that is, the survivability and reproductive prospects of each offspring. That's the story about packaging the investment that one is going to make in offspring size versus number, and that will depend in general on ecology. Finally, human menopause, a huge puzzle to be explained by this theory, is very unusual, but we think we have at least the outlines of a good explanation for it, and it probably is a key to our success as a species. It lets Granny help us reproduce faster than other hominids. And this figure from the textbook shows life tables for 3 hunter-gatherer populations. In fact, yes, none of these are the Hadza that Kristen has worked on. These are the Kung, the Yanomamo from South America, and Aceh, who are also from South America, modern hunter-gatherers. And they all experience menopause the same age as any other people do and go on living for decades thereafter. So it is definitely not true, as people often imagine, that there aren't any old people in hunter-gatherer populations. There definitely are. There just aren't quite as many of them, not surprisingly, because they suffer higher rates of extrinsic mortality at all ages, just owing to their way of life. The big difference between these hunter-gatherer life tables actually and ours is the early childhood mortality, which is horrific up to age 10 or so in a way that we've learned to overcome with nutrition and modern medicine and so on. So if you just apply minor adjustments to these life tables, they look just like ours. All right, so that's it for the evolution of life histories. We'll end there and see you next time.